This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com, and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Robert Spencer here, and it's another time to talk about the war on the freedom of speech. And for this, let's go back and think about a few first principles. In the first place, what is jihad for? Why do Muslims scream Allahu Akbar and kill people? Well, the reason is ultimately to undermine, and ultimately they hope to destroy, the non-Muslim systems of government in the countries where they are doing these attacks, so that these systems of government fail, so that ultimately they will be replaced by Sharia governments, governments ruled according to Islamic law. The purpose of jihad is ultimately to impose Sharia over non-Muslim states. Now, Sharia, Islamic law, is considered to be the perfect and immutable law of Allah, derived from the Quran and the example of Muhammad and the words and deeds of Muhammad as recorded in the Hadith. Now, the Sharia forbids criticism of Islam on penalty of death. Criticism of Allah, criticism of Muhammad, criticism of the Quran, all death penalty offenses. So, we have now an organization, the largest voting bloc at the United Nations, called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has been, for about 10 years now, trying to get the Western states, particularly the United States, to criminalize what it calls incitement to religious hatred. Now, if you think about it, incitement and hatred are subjective judgments. If somebody says something, then it's not necessarily incitement or hatred. It might be factual in a way that somebody else doesn't like, doesn't want known, and so they say that it's hateful. But the question of whether it's objectively hateful, that's impossible to establish, really, in many, many cases. Now, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, in trying to get the Western countries to criminalize incitement to religious hatred, what they really are trying to do is shut down criticism of Islam. And they're doing that for two reasons. One, because criticism of Islam is forbidden in Islamic law, and they want us to adopt Islamic law in the West. That is one of the things that they think is a foremost imperative that they have to pursue as Muslims. And second, they want to forestall criticism of Islam, because once there is no criticism of Islam, there can be no discussion of the motivating ideology behind jihad terror, and thus no countering of that motivating ideology behind jihad terror, and thus it will be able to advance unopposed and unimpeded. So, what does all this have to do with our topic at hand? Good question. What we have nowadays in the West is not so much an assault on the law, although certainly there are forces in the United States, and some of them quite powerful, that would overturn the First Amendment's protection of the freedom of speech if they had the chance. But what we have is what Hillary Clinton called a few years back old-fashioned methods of peer pressure and shaming. And she made that famous statement actually in connection with attempts to implement the OIC's hope of criminalizing incitement to religious hatred. She said, we have this First Amendment that we have to deal with, but we can resort to old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming to get people not to do what we don't want them to do. And this has just played out in the last few days in a rather exemplary case that happened once again, unfortunately, to me. I was asked to write a story, an article, for The Hill, the political journal online. I was kind of surprised to be asked, but I thought, well, Trump is becoming president, and maybe they're trying to broaden their editorial perspective a little bit. And they asked me to write, it was a bit disappointing, about Lindsay Lohan, the actress. And I don't know much about Lindsay Lohan and don't care anything about her, but in any case, I did nonetheless research and write the piece and sent it in, and it was put up. And that was that, I thought. But the outcry began immediately on Twitter and I'm sure that the Hill was also inundated with emails and so on of people complaining that this terrible racist, bigoted Islamophobe Spencer had been given a platform at the Hill. I didn't really think too much of that either until about 24 hours after the Hill put up the story. They took it down. They never communicated with me. There was no explanation. There was no indication of anything in it being factually false, which of course there wasn't anything factually false in it. There was no explanation whatsoever, but it was clear that they had succumbed to what Hillary Clinton would call old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming in order to get them to foreclose upon their criticism of Islam. And so you see, we do have the First Amendment, we do have the protection of the freedom of speech in the United States, but what we don't have in the United States is any respect for the freedom of speech. The mainstream establishment propaganda media, of which of course the Hill is a part, is either completely compromised already to this agenda or easily manipulated by peer pressure and shaming into doing the bidding of those who would eliminate all criticism of Islam so that the jihad can advance unopposed and unimpeded, and Sharia can ultimately be implemented in the United States. The idea that it's racist or bigoted to criticize Islam in the first place is another example of this. These organizations in the United States, such as the Council on American Islamic Relations and others, have worked assiduously for years to demonize, stigmatize, and marginalize anyone who dared to say anything remotely critical or to identify the motivating ideology of the jihad terrorists. This has been called hateful and bigoted for so long that most people don't even think about it at all. They take it for granted that to talk about the Quran, to talk about how the Quran says to kill them wherever you find them. It says to fight against and subjugate the people of the book. It says when you meet the unbelievers, strike the next. That the proper response to that is, haven't you read your Bible, you fundamentalist idiot? Don't you realize there's violence in it as well? And how can you be so bigoted? And so on. In other words, it's perfectly fine as far as these people are concerned for Muslims to commit jihad terror attacks, to invoke the Quran to do so, to point to those passages. But if we notice, then we are racist, bigoted Islamophobes, to be subjected to peer pressure and shaming and thus ruled out of polite society. Now, the goal of this agenda is quite insidious and quite obvious. If all the voices, and there is nobody who will be spared, you can see that when you see even reliably leftist spokesmen like Bill Maher and Sam Harris, when they dared to say anything critical about Islam, suddenly they were racist, bigoted Islamophobes as well. And anybody who speaks critically about these issues, about what it is that makes jihadis kill, gets stigmatized in this way. The object is to silence us all. And then nobody would dare to say anything. And as the jihad advances, as jihad attacks get more common in the United States, as it becomes a matter of daily life that you might get blown up going to the mall or going to the movies or going to a party or something of this kind, it's racist and bigoted and Islamophobic to say anything about it. And that's exactly where they want us, because that's exactly what Islamic law says. Criticism of Islam is forbidden. Islam mandates jihad warfare against unbelievers. That means criticism of jihad warfare against unbelievers is forbidden. It's a tiny minority of extremists. Every religion has its extremists. You're a racist and bigot if you think otherwise, and that's that. And so sit back, let the knife go through your neck, and relax. I'm Robert Spencer.